Hi everyone and welcome to my tutorial on getting started with Pygame. Now this tutorial is going to be slightly different from the ones that I've done previously, and if you've watched those tutorials you know that they're usually very procedure driven. This one I've created a PowerPoint presentation and pretty much I'm just going to use that as a tool to translate my information to you. So what we're going to focus on is what exactly Pygame is and how we can get started with using the library's capabilities. We'll also cover the main elements used within a game. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now in my tutorial about installing Pygame, I slightly covered what the library is and what it's all about. But just to clarify, I'm going to make some additional comments on what exactly Pygame is. First off, Pygame is a game development library. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that it's strictly only used for games. It just means that all the functions within the library are pretty much optimized for gaming, I guess you could say. And beyond that, truth is that you don't necessarily need Pygame to create games. You can still create your own games without Pygame. It's just that would be a lot more difficult, which gets me to my next point, which is that Pygame makes game development very simple because of all the functions that it gives you access to. Doing what Pygame does manually would waste a lot of your time and make your life a lot harder. Lastly, it's important to note that Pygame has its own unique functions and rules. The syntax is the same as Python. You still have classes, functions, all that stuff, and all you really need to know is that Pygame has a lot of functions that we will need to explore. And in that sense, you could interpret it as a new language when you're learning it, because it is kind of difficult. So now that we know what Pygame is, let's explore what it means to create a game. So all games have what is known as a game loop, and the game loop is what houses all of your game's processes, including controlling the characters and displaying all the graphics. Now inside the game loop, we have a processing section where we pretty much detect all the user's input, and we pretty much just handle all the input in that section. And most of the time this input is either mouse clicks or button presses. And after this we have the rendering section, and this is the section that is responsible for showing all the stuff that appears on your screen. So this shows characters, backgrounds, features, and it's all done within this section. Lastly, we have the updating section, and this section is responsible for essentially updating the game. And really this section is really dependent on what type of game you're exactly creating. So you might want to update the movement of your character, you might want to have animations for your character, or you might have like a scorekeeper or something. And it really depends on what your game is all about. So now that we've explored exactly what Pygame is about and what comprises a game, I thought it would be best if we created our own template for creating games in Pygame. So let's hop on over to Visual Studio Code and begin running a template. Okay, so now that we have Visual Studio Code opened up, we can begin coding our Pygame template. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just put a comment at the top saying Pygame template. And then underneath that, I'll import my libraries. So obviously I'm going to import the Pygame library first. And underneath that, I'm actually going to import the random library. Now, the reason I'm importing random is because it's randomness that makes games interesting. Most of the time we have either random items, random spawns, random slots, anything that you can think of that involves randomness, and most of the time in your game you're going to use some form of random element, so it just makes sense to import the random library as well. So after that, I'll define screen settings, and the first thing that I'm going to define is the width, and I'll set that to 320, and then I'm going to define the height, and I'm going to set that to 480. Let's leave a comment over here saying width of the screen, and I'll do the same for height. Now notice that I'm using capital letters for these variables, and the reason that I'm doing this is because in Python there's no constant variable declaration. Like if you ever use JavaScript, you know there's a variable declaration called const that you can use to define a constant variable. Since we don't have that luxury in Python, we often use capital letters to show that this variable is not going to change. So after I define width and height, I'll define FPS. And if you don't know what FPS is, it's pretty much just frames per second. And what frames per second means is pretty much the amount of time your program is going to rest on a single frame. So for instance, by setting it to 30, each frame is going to last 0.03 seconds. And after we define screen settings, we can initialize Pygame. So the way we do that is through the pygame.init command, and then after we've initialized Pygame, we'll also initialize the mixer. And pretty much what the mixer is this thing in Pygame which pretty much just controls all the music in your game. So the mixer is responsible for playing sound effects, background music, and that's all I can think of right now for some reason. But pretty much this is just for the music in your game. And then after we define the mixer, I'm going to define my screen. And the way we do this is by pygame.display.set_mode. And we use two brackets here. And then the argument we give is the width and the height variables that we defined earlier. And then after we've defined that, I'm going to set the title of my game. So the way we do that is pygame.display.set_caption. And in quotations, just write the title of your game. Now, what set caption does specifically is that when you open a window, at the top of the window, normally you see some text specifying what the program is. In Pygame, this text will be whatever you put inside these brackets over here. So after we've done that, the last thing that we need to do for this section is just say clock equals pygame dot pygame.time.clock. Okay, so before we start the game loop, there's one other thing that I like to do, and that is to define some colors that we will use. And now the thing is, Pygame uses the RGB color format. And if you don't know what that is, it pretty much basically red, green, and blue are the primary colors of the universe. If you've ever taken physics, you've probably heard that they're the real primary colors, not red, yellow, and blue like you've heard in art class. And basically computer pixels use red, green, and blue to display colors. And before we get farther into this, I'm just gonna go back to the PowerPoint and show you a more specific example. So when I say RGB colors, I'm talking about the colors red, green, and blue. And pretty much the main idea of RGB is that the colors red, green, and blue can be defined in a specific ratio to get any color that you want. So for instance, if I wanted the color black, I would have to turn all of these colors off and then I'd get the color black. And the reason this is because computer pixels actually use the colors red, green, and blue to show the colors that you find on your display. So over here, for instance, on this table, my pixels are combining red and the color green to get yellow over here. And pretty much when we turn all the colors on, we get this white over here. So pretty much what you need to know about RGB colors is that in Python, we store them as tuple objects. So a tuple object is pretty much similar to a list. It's just that it's covered in round brackets rather than square brackets. And pretty much in this tuple object, the left column represents the color red, the middle column represents the color green, and the right column represents the color blue. So like I said earlier, when we turn all of these to 0, we get the color black. When we turn all of them to 255, we get the color white. And also bear in mind, I think I didn't mention this before, but RGB values range from 0 to 255. So pretty much you get 256 options in between for each color. So 255 means that it's completely turned on. So you can see over here, when the left column is completely turned on, we get red. When the middle column is completely turned on, we get green. When the last column is completely turned on, we get blue. And then if we combine red and green completely, we get yellow. If we combine red and blue completely, we get magenta. If we combine blue and green completely, we get cyan. Okay, so now that we have Visual Studio Code open again, I'm going to define some of these colors that we're going to use. So the first color that I'm going to define is black, and I'm going to set that to be 0, 0, 0, and we saw that from the example before. And then I'm going to define white. I'm going to set that to 255, 255, and 255. Then red. Then green. And then blue. Okay, so now that we've defined some colors, we can get started on our game loop. So over here I'll say game loop. And the way that I'm going to control this game loop is that I'm first going to create a variable and call it running, and then I'll set that to true, and I'll say while running, the game loop will be running. And in here, like I said before, we have three sections. We have the input section, then we have the render section, I'll say render slash draw, and then we have the update section. So the first section that I want to get started on is the render section. And what you need to know about this section is that there are two main methods we use. We use the screen.fill function and we use the pygame.display.flip function. So what you need to know is that the screen.fill function is what shows pixels on your screen. So in this template, what we're going to do is that we're going to fill the screen with a background. We're going to fill it with the color black. And what you need to know about this process is that it's actually really slow. So what we do when we use the screen.fill function is that we tell our GPU to change a pixel on our display, and that obviously takes some time to do. And if you have a lot of things to draw, this process can actually get really slow. So the way that we resolve this is through something called the pygame.display.flip function. And what this does is that it uses this concept called double buffering. And the idea of double buffering can be represented through a double whiteboard analogy. So pretend you had a double-sided whiteboard, and on the first side you are writing some form of essay. Now the thing is that you can show this to your audience each time. So for instance, every time you write a letter, you could show it to the audience, or you could write the entire essay and then just show it to the audience at one time. And that's pretty much the idea of the pygame.display.flip function. So what that means is that we're going to draw everything on the screen at once, and then we're pretty much going to show the screen to the user rather than changing a pixel each time and then showing it to the user. So by doing that, we save a lot of time. So in our render section, all we need to include is screen.fill, and then I'll fill that with color black, and then pygame.display.flip. And also, I should probably mention this before things get confusing. Pygame.display.flip has to be the last thing in your program. If it's not, some of your objects that you're trying to show on the screen might actually not appear. So this should actually go after your update section. And now that that's out of the way, we're going to talk about input. So the way input is stored in Pygame is it's actually all stored in a list called events. And pretty much how we access these events is through the pygame.event.get method. And the thing is that each event is stored after a frame passes on your screen. The other thing is that there is actually one event that we need to handle before anything, and that's closing the window. So if I were to run this program right now, we get this window over here, but notice that it actually crashes right away. And the reason that it does that is because it doesn't know how to actually close the window. Because if I were to press this button over here, nothing would actually happen. So anyways, let's fix that. And the way that we're going to fix that is in input, say for event in pygame.event.get, if event equals pygame.quit, we will set running equal to false, which will break this loop. So we're actually going to keep the update section empty for right now because we don't actually have a game or anything to actually update. So at the bottom of this loop, you just have to add pygame.quit. And the last thing that we are going to do is set our game's FPS. So the way that we do this is simply clock.tick and then in brackets FPS. So that is a pretty good start in our Pygame career. And pretty much this is just a template that you can use for any project that you want to get started on. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. And please like, share, and subscribe.